The content of this episode may not be suitable for some audiences. Listener's discretion is advised. Welcome to the place of rest, where our aim is to give you language that helps you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of our times. In today's episode, Virginia discusses the profound spiritual and historical foundations of America's 5 core documents, demonstrating that national sovereignty can only be sustained when a citizenry actively honors the divine principles of internal self-governance. We hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Today's a great day. And it's a great time to be alive because we're going to celebrate 250 years of our very young nation. A republic under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And today, briefly, I just wanted to mention 5 documents, 3 principles established one nation and secured the destiny of what we call these United States of America. And the reason I think these documents are important is because they explain the image, the spirit, the soul, and the body of a nation whose identity is uniquely explained by the ideas that we find in ancient documents, well supported by history. The origin of the ideas that established this republic that are rooted in Judeo-Christian tradition. Why? Because they speak to universal principles that are without exception. And these documents and these ideas, the origin, the heritage, if you will, of this nation is rooted in these ideas that accounted for the sovereignty of the individual, the absolute truth of universal principles, not ideas, but principles that are irrefutable, that can only be enjoyed and understood when a people, by voluntary consent, submit to those principles and the idea that that would secure freedom and advance life. And that's very much the identity of our nation. And I'm going to read a few things to make my case. And they're not things that are unfamiliar to you, our listening audience. They're things and ideas that we hear, but somehow it's like water off a duck's back. But in this day and age of great confusion, chaos, and disease, we see that the common sense of these basic ideas that were instrumental in establishing our republic are being undermined and attacked. And often we are ridiculed for standing on the side of both well-documented history and common sense as not being enlightened enough or woke enough to cooperate with the changing times. Well, I want to celebrate not just the sacrifice of these men, but I want to celebrate the fact that there is one God working in the lives of men and nations. And many times when civilizations and certainly generations and nations thought it was going to be the end of them, specifically, we'll talk about that little nation in the Middle East because their history is so well documented in the canon, in the scriptures, that even when they were at the verge of extinction, right? God says, no, I've chosen you, Israel, to prove to humanity that I am God, and I choose the broken, foolish, stubborn, unrelenting people to do my finest work in. And I'm going to set you apart as a nation so that the people will know that you're my people and I'm their God, and I will bring salvation to the world through this unconventional means of documenting your story so well. And the ideas that established that nation, that little nation of Israel, in that tiny piece of land, right, in the Middle East, we see the great work of God in the lives of men and nations modeled by how he dealt with and engaged that particular nation. But of course, our founding fathers were of European descent and whatnot, and they studied ancient civilizations, ancient traditions, world history, philosophy, theology, physics. These were great thinkers that understood that there were universal principles that could be trusted to create, sustain, and expand life, and they were rooted in these ancient documents. And the fruit of their ideas is what established this republic, these United States of America. And the purpose, so I mentioned a little bit about image. I mentioned our identity is very much rooted in these ancient teachings, ancient traditions, and ancient histories where we saw the rise and fall of nations and the fruit of the ideas of men at work, right, to expand their nations. And we saw their demise. And God saying, no, your purpose and the purpose of this nation, of this republic, is to be that shining city on a hill, and the world would see why I am God. And these ideas that I have explained and advanced in the history of another nation across the Pacific, specifically Israel, you're going to see how I'm going to bring salvation to the world. But in America, I'm going to do something I've never done before. And I'm going to finally, after many attempts to settle this piece of land you call North America, I'm going to give wisdom and direction and perspective and inspiration to a group of men that are pursuing one simple thing, and that is to protect their sovereignty. And they want to get away from the throne, from the monarchy, from the rule of man, to worship me freely, knowing that I'm the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, that they're going to seek just peace and freedom to live according to all the promises of these ancient documents. Well, little do they know that when they immigrated to America, that the crown was kind of using them to settle a new land, but the crown had no intention of releasing the grip of rule and dominion over them. So what began as a collaborative relationship, hey, we go, we settle, and we're happy still to be British and to be Englishmen settling this new land, that the reach of the monarchy would be so great and the imposition would be so severe and the cruelty would be so painful that these men that originally settled and established what would come to know, we'll talk about the documents that were established to secure the republic, but that when they came and they settled, they realized, hey, this isn't going to work out. The initial group that came to America, let's remember that they were dying. The weather was severe. The conditions were brutal. The future looked dismal. So basically, you have the spirit, the soul, and the body of Great Britain, of a nation that they thought with good intent, and many travelers, sojourners, pilgrims, right, that wanted to come and said, we'll go, send us, because they wanted freedom from the reign of the monarchy. But that didn't mean they wanted independence. They were willing to maintain a relationship with them, right? They just wanted to come to a new land to worship freely. Well, in short order, they realized it was a lot harder than they had perhaps anticipated. I mean, let's think about it. Who can't relate to that? We all start on adventures with good intentions, but somehow there are complexities we didn't anticipate. And as is the story of those first pilgrims. But in short order, they began to die. So for the rest of today, I wanted to just mention that these 5 documents, supported by 3 ideas, establish this one nation. And I wanted to simplify why the world wants to come to America. And it's really rooted in those 3 principles. But first, I want to mention the 5 documents. In 1620, the Mayflower Compact was instituted, and it is the first documented legal, civil contract by voluntary consent of those that were perishing to self-govern. It would no longer be a communal system because that wasn't working. That's how they were dying. Some people did too much. Others didn't do any. And they were dying. And so Bradford consulted the scriptures because they were in crisis, as we all do. When we're in major crisis, what do? We open our Bibles that we have to dust off because we haven't looked at in years. And he consulted the scriptures, and they established the framework of individual self-government because they reasoned through principles of scripture. They were people of faith anyway, so it wasn't a long stretch for them. But after trying all their good ideas of community living, communism, community leadership, they began to die, and it wasn't working. So he realized the depravity of the human condition was leaving them destitute. So they reasoned from the scripture that everyone was sovereign and had the capacity of voluntary consent. And they had the right to govern their own private affairs as they wish. If they want to work, they can survive and work, build, farm, do, and then trade with the rest of the community. And the people would live according to the dictates of their own conscience. And the Mayflower Compact established an agreement that they would engage each other, not in community, everybody coming together and do the best, bring everything they could to bear. That was not working because by the human nature dictates that that's not how people operate. They don't show up and do the right thing. They live according to the dictates of what suits them and what's easiest for them. And they're always judging the efforts of another. And so they began to die. So the Mayflower Compact really was the first document of individual self-government, and it brought an end to that discourse, if you will. I know it's oversimplified and not quite how you read it in your history books, but Miss Dang, a scholar of primary sources, she's a history. She's written several volumes on history, ancient, middle, and now modern history, traces this frame of mind throughout history and the implications of it. And of course, she goes to ancient documents, but we see it played out right here. So in 1620, the Mayflower Compact was established, and I would invite everyone to, take a look. From that came the Declaration of Independence. Why? Because the oppression, it became crippling and it became unjust. The original settlers never intended to establish independence. They thought they could engage in a collaborative relationship where they would just have the freedom to worship God outside of the confinements, among many things, not just of the crown, but also of the Catholic Church. That was very entangled, if you will, with government, which explains why in all of our documents and the documents that follow, protecting the sovereignty of the individual from the imposition of government was the aim and the goal of our founders. It wasn't to protect the government from the control of the people. It was to protect the people from the infringement of the government. So we see how that's been manipulated in our lifetime and distorted. And frankly, it's a lie. The separation of church and state, which is a phrase that everyone likes to throw around, you need to do a little bit of homework and a little bit of reading to understand that it's being weaponized against us. It's to protect us from the encroachment of the federal government into our lives, because that's the very thing that caused the what? Revolutionary War. To break from the brutality, what became the brutal reign of the crown and encroachment on the settlers here in these United States. The second document is the Declaration of Independence. And I wrote a little something just that I think is instructive and it's inspirational. It's a historic document, of course, adopted on July 4, 1776 by the Second Continental Congress, which announced the separation of the 13 colonies from Great Britain and outlined the principles of individual rights, people's innate individual capacity to self-govern, and the government by the consent of the people. So this republic right there in that statement, right, we clearly understand that this republic is completely inadequate for a people that do not self-govern. By the way, that's why the powers that be want to do what? Alter the Constitution. They can't do away with the Declaration of Independence, but they think they can continue to alter the Constitution to accommodate the progressive ideology of an evolving people. They're so ignorant that they don't understand that that's a hard act to sell. Because how do this enlightened generation of ours, how do we self-destruct at the rate that we're self-destructing and kill our babies at the rate that we've killed our babies to accommodate our so-called freedom? How do we outlaw and create laws to expose people that are exposing the corruption in government? How is it we're creating laws against the people that are exposing the laws? The Nick Shirley law here in California. How is it that it's possible that in the name of enlightenment and progressive ideas, we're self-destructing in very real ways? The suicide rate among our own children, among our teenagers, is off the charts. Homicide, suicide, our inner cities, where all of our local and state governments gather in each individual state to protect supposedly the sovereignty of people. We must stop and realize that these principles, these ideas that protect our very sovereignty are being encroached upon by the government. And we're not consenting to these ideas and these worldviews, but we find ourselves in such a moral stupor, if you will, that we can't see the forest for the trees. But in short, this Declaration of Independence, the second document I wanted to mention today, is considered a foundational text of the United States of America, asserting that all men are created equal and have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and freedom. The pursuit of happiness is freedom. You need life. You need liberty. And you need freedom to pursue happiness. I just want to point out for our consideration, think about how crippling the confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of the age have become in this second document that I'm mentioning lightly for a minute. That I just mentioned how we've desecrated life. How? By violating our conscience, which cripples our liberty. So we can't pursue happiness because there's no freedom in desecrating life, in violating our own conscience. We can't pursue happiness. That's why we have a nation medicated on antidepressants and categorized and labeled and marginalized by the DSM-5 that claims to diagnose, treat, and cure our conditions. When 20, 30, 40 years into this, we're in the worst. We have a mental health care crisis in America. Hey, so something's wrong here. All of us, the desire to have peace and rest and freedom, need to understand there's principles of individual rights that the government that are in positions of authority by our consent. We've dropped a few stitches there. Something's seriously wrong. So we have an opportunity to understand what framed this republic, what established these United States of America. Because if we don't see where we've gone wrong, we won't know how to take personal responsibility to turn this thing around. And I've stated, we can turn this thing around in one generation. So after the establishment of this Declaration of Independence, and I'd like to read something. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth, that would be God, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitles them, a dissent, respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the cause which impelled them to separation. Perhaps rest is an invitation to understand that first line in the Declaration of Independence, and I would encourage everyone listening to please go read it and understand what kind of separation is necessary among my own constituents, my spirit, my soul, my body. Perhaps I can tell my flesh, hey, I know you love to indulge in X, Y, and Z, but we're not doing that anymore. Because now I understand that liberty is a function of my soul, my conscience, and my liberty is going to take me to the things that compel me. So the things that drive me can't any longer have a dominion over me. Perhaps you need to write a Declaration of Independence of your soul to self-govern, and you will no longer surrender to the passions of your flesh that are driving you to do crazy things that you know are destructive and are hurting you, your children, your relationships, your job, your community, your nation. I guess I want to invite everyone to just not look at these things as ancient documents. Understand that these documents establishes civil liberties, the capacity for each individual, the necessity for each individual to self-govern, to survive, followed by the Declaration of Independence, speaking to the sovereign right of the individual to self-govern, and that these are endorsed, protected, proven by what? By natural law, by laws of nature, and nature's God. that we get to the place where we have to what? Declare our independence. Well, sometimes we need to declare our independence from our own destructive behavior that is driving our lives to the ground. But I want to encourage everyone listening. I don't care how bad what you're dealing with is, or how bad what you've done is, or how bad the future looks. I want to tell you today that you can have hope, because this is a universal principle that when you decide no more, not on my watch, my life will not go down into this dark abyss. I will self-govern. I will not continue to surrender to the impulses of my flesh. That you're declaring an independence against perhaps a encroaching government dictated by your passions that's destroying your very life. Declare independence from your own depravity and say no more, and then cry out to the powers of heaven, just like our founding fathers did, and say, God, help me. So take that first line of the Declaration of Independence, and I want you to make a declaration for your private life.
Are you listening to today's episode yet feel the tug of modern confusion in your life? Virginia has spent decades helping individuals unwrap complex systems to find clarity, order, and ease. In order to move from simply listening to a broadcast into experiencing a conversation, we discovered a space to gather, ask questions, and expand our reasoning together. That is why R.E.S.T with Virginia Dixon is officially expanding to Substack. We are inviting you to step out of passive consumption and join us at virginiadixon.substack.com. Right now, on our platform, you can post your questions about these episodes, learn the laws of nature and self-evident truths that speak to our natural affections, and discover how to secure external freedom by accessing internal liberty through exercising self-governance with Virginia. Don't forfeit your personal government to the noise of a chaotic world. Subscribe today at virginiadixon.substack.com. Join the conversation and let us heal the heart of this generation together.
Now, no smooth sailing after this Declaration of Independence, right? And the Revolutionary War was won. I wish I could say that it all ended there, but it didn't. Several years later, we ratified the Constitution of these United States. But in between were the Federalist Papers, and there were arguments, violent, vicious arguments, hard conversations, not just in defense of the Declaration of Independence, but arguments that now that's not sufficient to declare independence for them. How are we going to constitute these United States of America? What ideas are going to establish these United States? That was the third document, the Constitution. I would encourage everyone. Hillsdale College has incredible lessons on this, and they're free. hillsdalecollege.com, that explain not only all of these documents, but make a case for why these United States are not the idea of men. There's a great movie out on George Washington. Please, 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 please go watch it, and you will see the hand of providence blessing the ideas, the desires, the convictions of our first settlers to just pursue the right to worship, pursue a place, and make sacrifices in their pilgrimage, right, to a place where they could worship God freely. Then you'll understand why the conviction of men that established this republic was rooted in the knowledge, the certainty, and the understanding that there was one God ruling in the affairs of men and nations, and he would secure their desire to come and worship him freely. So the arguments in defense of the Constitution and the need for a Constitution that would unify them, you will find in the Federalist Papers. Again, Hillsdale College has a great course on that. John Adams made his position very clear. Thomas Jefferson made his position very clear. And they were the best of friends. And they became enemies there for a while. And they both died July 4th, 15 years after signing the Constitution. And they died and they left time in such a beautiful way because they drafted beautiful, clear, concise thoughts about their position and about each other. And Adams didn't realize that Jefferson was dying as well. And his last words were, "Thank God Thomas Jefferson remains." So he was thankful that Thomas Jefferson would remain to protect what? The voice of the Constitution. So almost from its conception, you need to understand that these United States of America were absolutely and unquestionably under attack by forces of the seen and unseen world that do not advance what? Light, life, liberty, love, and law. That's why the world wants to come to America, because there is something sacred, not just in the conception of this republic, but in advancing and sustaining its life. The Monroe Document. And that is how we as a people, we as a family, we as a sovereign nation would engage, not just to protect our sovereignty, but to advance that of other nations as well. And I think the person that we hear speak to this very, very clearly, always, like him or not, is Donald Trump. He advances the ideas of of sovereignty, not just of the individual, but of nations. And these 5 documents explain this one nation in a way that I have not heard, read, or understood to be the case in any other nation but Israel. There's something about the establishment and the pilgrimage that those Europeans embarked on here to secure their sovereignty, to establish an identity, to worship freely, that ultimately did establish a nation. The only other people or nation that I've read of anything like that about is Israel. And we clearly understand that he chose the foolish things, and he chooses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And Israel was not a nation of their own making. It was the idea of God to bring salvation and redemption to the world because they were so stubborn, because they were so corrupt, because they were so fragmented. They were just slaves. They were slaves that he invited, and he opened. He created the opportunities, and he sent a leader for them to abandon and leave that whole lifestyle behind them. And he created a path forward. By the way, Egypt was very abusive, but they also took care of their slaves because there were almost 1 million of them, and they represented an economy. They were the Egyptian economy. So Egypt was cruel, as dictators often are, or slave masters often are. Taskmasters, right? But the hope of freedom, we have to realize, is something that the slaves in Egypt didn't even know what freedom was. They were born into slavery, much like we are. We as people are born into slavery. We're carrying a heritage, a memory of things that we know very little or nothing of. Why? Because our stories don't begin in our home. They begin in the home of a parent's parents' parents. And something about the human condition that's flawed that we inherit. And in these ancient documents, we see that we're enslaved by our own heritage. But something beautiful happens early on in our lives, and we hear this quiet, still voice that invites us to freedom and invites us to be free. And then we begin to recognize that voice of the lover of our soul, the creator of our universe. And then somehow in our own pilgrimage through time, we find out there's this bigger story. And it has a book. It has 66 books. And it starts by explaining the perils of the human condition. And it tells us the story of the story of the story of the story of our ancestors. And we realize, wait a minute, we're all a bunch of nomads. We are all a bunch of immigrants everywhere. And the story of how men populated and occupied nations is tightly woven into this bigger story of this person whose voice we hear, inviting us to rest, speaking to us for a lifetime. And we come to recognize that that God is not just an existential being that we can experience through different means, but he's personal, he's intimate, and he shows up in our lives in remarkable ways. And it's his is a story we'll tell because he never failed us. And when we in our pilgrimage as settlers in time begin to see the fingerprints of God well documented in how he's worked in the lives of men and nations, we begin to take special interest in what's happening in the Middle East. That the story of Abraham and Sarah having 2 children, one was a child of disobedience, right? God bless him. It wasn't no fault of his, but he was still the child of rebellion and disobedience. And that would be his story, and God would make a great nation out of him, right? But the other was a child of promise, Isaac, and from him would come a whole nation, which we know that's what the Jewish people, the Hebrews came from that line, right? But all of a sudden we see this beautiful story of how God works in the lives of men and nations. And if we can put everything we think we understand about politics and understand, wait, politics come from policies made by men. But where did the story truly begin of how God works in the lives of men and nations? We begin to become very curious about this unfolding story. And what's America? Just one nation. One particular nation that we have a story that was established around these ideas consistent with those that established a nation of a people that live on the other side of earth. And all of a sudden, we don't have to become hateful about anybody, but we can look at ourselves in the context of this bigger narrative of how God's working. And the liberty that man has had throughout the beginning of time to align himself with some ideas over others, some nation over others. And then we just have one very simple question to ask ourselves. Are we going to align ourselves with the ideas and the stories that create and invite us to create and advance life, to subdue life, and then to take personal dominion over how we live our lives? And that's the story of liberty and freedom, right? The invitation to live that way. Or do we align ourselves with political systems and the ideas of men that build up empires? And do we align ourselves with those systems? And I know I kind of went rogue a little bit, inviting people to think differently about the experiences we're having and what's happening in the world. and to become curious about, wow, what established these nations? But what secured this republic uniquely? And I'm telling you that I can prove to you that America was established and secured by 5 documents: the Mayflower Compact, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, when for the first time in recorded history, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, not community, a more perfect union by voluntary consent, establish justice, secure domestic tranquility, and provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to secure ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America, because it alone can secure freedom. 3rd document, there it is. And I realize right now I failed to mention George Washington's farewell address. That's the 4th document I would invite you all to read. And finally, the Monroe Document. It establishes and lays the tenets and the foundation of how we, as a sovereign people, a sovereign nation, will protect the dignity of others, secure our own, and protect and respect the dignity of how we involve and we engage others in this beautiful conversation to advance, to secure freedom and advance the cause of liberty throughout the world. We have so much to celebrate. We are all pilgrims on earth, in time, walking to this sacred place, which I call home. We'll make full circle and return home. Some of us do so prematurely. Some of us do so in ways we never dreamt, and others do so as a result of great tragedy. But here's the beauty in the ashes, that we do go home. And there are so many beautiful testimonies of near-death experiences where we see that this place, we all want to claim stake to everything, but we're all nomads. We're all pilgrims here. The world is God's and everything in it. But when we have clean hands and a pure heart, we can ascend into His presence and see, and the tapestry gets flipped over and we see the beauty of what He's doing in time. And sometimes when we exercise judgment over each other, over nations, over circumstances, over things, with condemnation and hate and resentment and bitterness, we stop being curious. And when we stop showing up with curiosity for ourselves, by the way, our spouses, our children, each other, and nations, we're going to be controlled and manipulated by dark forces that want to control us. To control us, they need to pit us against each other. They need to cause confusion, chaos, and disease to get us to what? Be diseased, ill, and dead. And we're watching that play out every single day. Perhaps one of the most beautiful moments of this World Cup is to watch ordinary, sovereign people. Some came in bikes from South America, some in motorbikes, some drove. Literally, some pedaled their bikes here because that's all they could afford. Others sold everything they had just to come to America to watch the World Cup games. To hear their testimonies and I can understand a few languages. It's a beautiful thing to go in to follow them and hear the extraordinary things they're saying about America. But I can't tell you how many times I've heard people from all over the world say they've been lying about America. What they said was not true. They're beautiful, kind, they're like us. And there was a quote I read, and I may butcher it, but it went something like this. It's like America threw a slumber party for all their cousins, and we're having the time of our lives, but they did it because the parents aren't talking. So the concept of voluntary consent came to mind, that in spite of the political, manipulative, dark, sinister rhetoric that the powers that be are using to divide us, they're not having the final word, because the world is showing up in the home of the free and the land of the brave and inviting them for a respite, to rest, and to celebrate the games. And to some extent, the stuff we deal with is so serious, it doesn't feel like a game. But in some beautiful way, in spite of the darkness and the terrible things we're witnessing in Venezuela and all over the world, I'm comforted that it is God that is advancing the cause of liberty in time for all humanity. In the United States of America and the ecclesia, the global children of God, the global community of God, is telling a different story. That it's God that rules and overrules in the lives of men and nations, and the tragedies that I think we all try to make sense of. July 4th, we celebrate because the destiny of man is not at the disposal of those who want to control us and manipulate us and use us for their personal gain. Ultimately, that is a nefarious evil that is upon us. But the beauty of the times in which we live, it's in full display. Choose this day who you will serve. In America, we proudly proclaim that we're one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And that's why at R.E.S.T, we are so happy to announce that we will be launching a global initiative in collaboration with Apple, who found out about our work and the things that we're doing. And there's going to be an app where we're going to take this message to the world. The message of R.E.S.T is fundamentally an invitation to humanity with resources to help you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of the age by displacing arguments and ideas that rise up against your knowledge of what's true. America is not a perfect nation. We're not a perfect people. That doesn't exist outside of the beauty and the wholeness of everything that God is. And we see it reflected in nature. But I'll tell you what America is. America and Americans, by and large, are committed to protect and advance the ideas of liberty. That alone can give you a taste of freedom. And it's to that end that we invite people to rest, because we know every single one of them, regardless of the condition they come in, they will experience freedom. They'll experience the freedom of wholeness. So I'm excited for this next season of our work. And I feel like this collaborative relationship we're going to enter into here, everything's in full swing already, that will be launched the first week of August. I feel like it's, I don't know, it's a gift I can give back as an immigrant to this country to say, oh, don't miss this about your story. People are lying to you. They're telling you a half truth about who you are. And at the end of the day, don't we have an identity crisis? Isn't that what we're all struggling with? Is an identity crisis? Isn't that what's always under attack, is our identity? Well, on this America's 250th birthday, as an immigrant, I'm so happy to be a part of, a small part of restoring America's identity, America's purpose, and telling a little bit about America's image, the spirit, the soul, and the body of this republic and what it represents. Thank you for rallying with me, because the ultimate invitation, right, is to humanity, that if you step into this place of rest, you can live in the freedom of wholeness. We just happen to have 5 documents, 3 ideas that establish one republic.
We hope listening to this episode has brought you closer to experiencing the freedom of wholeness and healing. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, or for updates about R.E.S.T, please visit our Instagram or Facebook at The Place of R.E.S.T. If you would like more information about Virginia, or to support and join the cause of R.E.S.T, please go to theplaceofrest.com/donate or call 949-289-5935. Thank you for listening to Rest with Virginia Dixon. We'll see you next week.